Hey everybody, we're back again to talk a little more about water today. We left off talking about cohesion and adhesion. If you remember, those are properties that come out of hydrogen bonds. Cohesion allows water molecules to stick to each other, and adhesion allows water molecules to stick to other non-polar covalent surfaces. There's an animation here that you can watch. I'm not going to do it right now, but if you go to the slide presentation, actually view it in presentation mode, you can click on that link and it will take you to a 48-second video that you can watch that kind of explains again what I went over last time if you're still a little confused on that. Another property that comes out of this whole hydrogen bonding is something called surface tension, and that's a measure of how difficult it is to break the surface of a liquid. Water is, for us big folk, humans, that is, it's very easy for us to break the surface of liquid. Anyone who has, tried to do a jump off of a diving board and done a belly flop knows that you can break the surface. It might hurt a lot, but you definitely can break it. However, water does have a very high surface tension, because, again, of the hydrogen bonds, which means that if you tend to be a critter that is spread out and fairly lightweight, like this little water spider here, then you are actually able to glide across the water without sinking in. So that's an important characteristic for some living organisms. So one of the things that College Board, again, wants you to understand is not just the properties of water, but how those properties apply to and make life possible. Okay, so in our previous example with adhesion and cohesion, it allows for transpiration, or that is the movement of water up a plant. Surface tension here, now we're talking about how different organisms are allowed to move across the surface of water, and so that creates evolution of animals that are able to use water in that fashion. Another property that comes out of the hydrogen bonds is specific heat. So specific heat has to do with how much heat can either be absorbed or released before the temperature of that substance changes. So high specific heat is going to allow for minimization. Is that a word, actually? It will minimize the temperature fluctuations for living systems. So our body, very high percentage of water. If we go out in the sun, it was a hot day here in Evanston, Illinois, and I was out for a bike ride, and I had to stop for several lights along the way, and I got pretty hot. Well, there's a lot of water in my body. Well, if the sun and the heat from the sun was able to very quickly break all those hydrogens bonds apart, I could actually start the water in my body could actually start boiling. Okay, so it is important to have that ability to maintain water as water and not for it to very quickly become boiling and then transfer into a gaseous state. Because if that happens, that's not stable and that's not good for living things. Okay, so I know some of you may be living near a large body of water. For example, I live near Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan, the water is cold even now. It is August 10th today, and it is still really cold. I don't know exactly what the temperature of the water is, but the reason that it's still fairly cold, even though it's been a fairly hot summer, is because of the fact that the water is able to take in so much heat, and because there are so many hydrogen bonds that you will not change, you'll not raise the temperature of the water very quickly, and you won't turn it into gas very quickly as well. Okay, so here's another example that out on the west coast. If you look at the Pacific Ocean on any given day, I don't know when this is, probably summer, Pacific Ocean is 68 degrees. And that's again because that water has so many hydrogen bonds. By definition, it has so many hydrogen bonds. It has a high specific heat, and it tends to keep the ocean cooler. So then all of these areas along here that are on the coast are going to benefit from that because the wind is going to come off of the lake, and the wind will be cooled down by the water. However, the further inland you get, the less close it is to the water, the further away it is from the water, and you see that the temperature is really going to rise there. So that's going to change again what things can exist in those different bands. So closer to the ocean, it's going to be more moderate, and that's going to allow for different critters to live. Okay, so that's high specific heat. Along with high specific heat, surface tension, and adhesion and cohesion, we have another property that comes out of those, again, hydrogen bonds. When in doubt, if they're asking you a question about water, you could probably defer to using hydrogen bonds as your answer if you don't know the answer, and you're probably going to be right because it almost always, what the properties of water do come out of hydrogen bonds. So you can just always throw that in there if you're desperate. I wouldn't use that as a first strategy, but if you're really desperate, you could use it. Okay, evaporative cooling. Now, this is the ability to transform a substance from a liquid to a gas. And you don't need to worry about the actual definition here that that it's the heat. Oh, wrong button. Let me go back here. That it's the heat liquid must absorb for 1 gram to be converted into gas. You don't need to worry about that. What we do want to focus on is the fact that in the summertime, you get hot and you sweat. Well, what water, again, is able to do is it is able to take the heat, right? Because I said that it can absorb a lot of heat. So it can absorb heat from your body through those droplets of water. And then as you, sit in front of the fan or fan yourself off or whatever it happens to be, that water evaporates. And as it evaporates, it is going to take the heat from your body with it, and that will cool your body down. So that's evaporative cooling. Again, evaporative cooling is important because we all know that when we start to overheat, if we, get too hot, we could have heat stroke. If we get too cold, that could be an issue as well. But right now we're just talking about sweating. So, we need to be careful that we keep our body temperature within a certain range, right? If we get too hot or if you get a fever, right, your body will start to sweat as well. So that's evaporative cooling. Okay, density of ice is another one. You may or may not have seen this, but, you have in some ways. Put an ice cube into water, what happens to it? It floats. Ice is less dense. What does that mean? It means that the hydrogen bonds in ice are farther apart. So the density is so it's less dense because the hydrogen bonds are farther apart. And because they're farther apart, that means that it floats. Okay? So, in a pond, ice, because it's less dense, floats to the top of the pond. And that's really important if you happen to be a fish. Because if you were a fish in a pond where it froze solid from bottom to top, then you would be a fish sickle. Okay? You would not be able to live in that body of water because there would be nowhere for you to hibernate or reduce your metabolism while it's cold, and then come back out in the spring and live your fishy life. Okay, so The fact that fish are at the bottom of the water and the ice is at the top allows them to survive over the winter time. Here's my little fishy. We want to make sure that he's not a fish sickle. Okay, so when we're at, this is ice, you can see how they're farther apart than they are here. Okay. Let's see. So this is kind of an issue for today's environment because we know that global warming and global climate change is a problem. And because icy environments around the globe are breaking apart and they're now becoming water, that can be a huge thing to a lot of creatures that depend on that ice and need that ice for survival. It's just a point to bring up. It's not really the fact that it doesn't really have anything to do with ice floating as much as it does that some creatures depend on very cold environments. And if you raise the temperature even a couple degrees, it could mean that they have a harder time surviving. They have a harder time living in those warmer environments, and they may be subject to extinction. So this is a picture. You're not going to be required to remember this, but I think it's interesting because there are, depending on what species you are, there are benefits and there are downsides to the loss of ice. So, for example, those benefiting from the loss of ice are things like phytoplankton, which are basically little tiny food for things like whales. And then I don't even know what a capelin is, but evidently they're benefited as well. Polar bears, however, walruses, these guillemots, birds, all have a harder time living in warmer environments. So there's global climate change is a thing, and there are some things that are, seeing an improvement in their conditions because of that change. All right, our last property, I think this is our last one, is water as a solvent. What does that mean? Well, if we talk about, again, kind of going back to chemistry, so a solution is when you take a couple of two or more things and you mix them together, and it's a homogeneous mix. So like you take milk and you take chocolate syrup and you put that together, and you have now a solution that's what we call chocolate milk. The solvent is going to be the dissolving agent of the solution, and the solute is the thing that's dissolved. So in this scenario, the solvent would be the milk, which is primarily, again, water, and the solute is the thing that's being dissolved in the into a solution, and that would be our chocolate syrup. Okay, so what water does, again, because of why? That's right, the hydrogen bonds. Because of the hydrogen bonds, they have these partial positives and they have these partial negatives. So remember, the hydrogens have a partial positive. So I've got all these little partial positives, partial positives, partial positives, partial positives. You get the idea. And then I have a bunch of negatives. Let's use a different color for that one. Negative, 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 negative. So when you put something that is ionic into a solution of water, remember, ionic means it's going to have a lot of charges. So all these sodiums are going to be positively charged and all these chlorines are going to be negatively charged. That allows the water molecules to surround each individual chlorine and sodium atom and pull it away from the bulk of the molecule. Okay, so that is an example of water being a good solvent. It can break things apart for that. And so we oftentimes talk about, it might be a prompt, an essay prompt where they ask you, water is a universal solvent. explain why it's a universal solvent. And you would go on to talk about its polarity. And what I mean by that is you would want to go on and you'd want to talk about how it's got those partial negative and partial positive bond, or partial negatives and partial positives due to the way the electrons are held unequally by the hydrogens and by the oxygens. So explaining how the hydrogen bonds come about, that would be the answer to that question. All right. So water can dissolve compounds that are made of non-ionic polar molecules. They can do charged molecules, but not ones that are ionically bonded. Even larger polar molecules, such as proteins, can dissolve in water if they have ionic and polar regions. Okay. So, in other words, universal solvent because it can break so much apart. And I think my cursor's stuck here. There we go. So here is purple in this textbook is often represented by, or proteins, I should say, is often represented by purple. So this purple molecule that you really can't see very well in this diagram, that is a protein. It's supposed to be a protein. And as we'll see in chapter 4, proteins have areas that are nonpolar covalent. And that, because of that, those water molecules can get in there and they can pull apart parts of that protein and break it down. So, literally, they say that you should drink something when you eat. And the reason you're drinking is because you're drinking probably something that's, well, hopefully, something that is by and large water. And that will help digestion because it is a universal solvent and it will help to break apart the molecules that you are eating and help with digestion. Okay, we have a random picture of a water molecule here. I'm not quite sure why, so I'm gonna skip over that for now. Let's see where we are in time here. Oh, we got tons of time. This is for you. Hopefully, there's been several days that have passed. For me, I've been doing this. I don't know, for about an hour and a half, so I'm kind of getting a little bit tired and my throat's getting a little bit sore, but we will continue on anyway. All right, so come on, go away. There we go. So another related, a couple of terms that we need to talk about when we talk about water is hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And hydro, remember, means water, and philia means like or love. So hydrophilic is going to be referring to something that loves or likes or has an affinity for water. Okay? Anything that is hydrophobic is one that doesn't have an affinity for water and tends to be repelled by it. So hydrophobic, a fear of. So it tends to have a fear of water. Classic example of that would be oil. Oil hates water. It's hydrophobic. And that's because they have nonpolar covalent bonds. Okay, water is polar covalent and oil is nonpolar. So they are repulsed by each other. You put the two together and they form little droplets trying to get as far away from the water as they can. Hydrophobic molecules related to oils are major ingredients in cell membranes, and every one of our cells is made up of a cell membrane. We don't want water to just easily be able to get into a cell, because if it did, it could cause the cell to burst. So because of that, we have a cell membrane that has a large percentage of it that is made of hydrophobic or oily substances that will not allow polar molecules in and out easily. And that's going to set up, down the road, that's going to set up all sorts of complications for how things get across cell membranes. But we'll talk about that, I think, in Unit 3. We'll leave that for now. All right. Most chemical reactions in organisms involve solids dissolved in water. Remember, we are mostly water. So our chemical reactions that are occurring in our body when we make, sodium, when we make urine, when we make, red blood cells, everything that we make is occurring in water. So it's really important that those solutes, whatever they happen to be able to work in an aqueous solution or be able to work in water, and not necessarily be just breaking apart willy-nilly. I'm also alluding to here in this next sentence about aqueous solutions and solutes, and that will come up when we get to talk about our potato lab. And the potato lab will be looking at osmosis and diffusion, which will actually be part of the second unit when we talk about transport. And once again, my dog is having... Oh, she just quit. She's having doggy dreams. So if you're wondering what that distressed animal is in the background, that's my dog just having some type of dream. So sorry about that. Okay. Next concept is acids and bases. So this is a little different from the hydrogen bonds. I know you're like, well, I should just put hydrogen bond down for the answer. You actually don't, in this case, want to put hydrogen bond down as the answer for why acids and bases form. So let's go over that. Hydrogen atoms in a hydrogen bond can actually shift. They can move. And sometimes the hydrogen atom can just straight up leave. And it leaves its electron behind. And as it leaves its electron behind, that means that it still has a proton. And so if that happens, we get what's called a hydrogen ion, or an H+. Okay. On the other hand, sometimes a water molecule can lose its proton. And when it does that, it's called a hydroxide ion, or OH negative, because it has one extra electron. It's lost a proton and it has one extra electron. Now, this doesn't happen very often. If you've got a drop of water, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a very small percentage of the water molecules that will give up a electron or give up a proton. But it's significant because it results in this thing called acids and bases. So even though it's a small amount, it is important. So here is a couple of water molecules. And in this case, the one on the right here has given up an electron. The electron's over here. And so it has an extra electron, so we call that OH negative. And this one's, because it lost the electron, it has one extra proton, so we call that a hydrogen ion. Okay. So these become important because the more of these hydrogen ions that you have, the more acidic a substance will become. So let's see if I can move that. There we go. So changes in the concentration of H pluses and OH negatives can dramatically affect the chemistry of a cell. And biologists use what's called the pH scale to describe whether or not a solution is acidic or basic. So let's talk about what that means to be acidic. So acids is any substance that increases the H plus concentration of a solution. And any base is a substance that reduces the H plus concentration of a solution. So normally the way this is looked at is if you've got a substance that is, the pH scale is going to go from 0 to 14. If you have a pH of exactly 7, that's neutral. That means it's not positive, it's not acidic, it's not basic, it's neutral. However, if you have a pH of, say, 5, then that would be an acid. And if you had a pH of, say, 9, that would be a base. Now, the reason this is important again, we're relating everything back to living systems, is because biological systems really need to be in this range of 6 to 8. If they get any more acidic or more basic, then the body can really, really suffer. And you could, in extreme cases, have death if you really don't keep that pH in check. Before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to clarify something, because I know sometimes people understand, I think, acids better than they do bases. So they hear the word acid and they like, oh yeah, I know something's acidic. It's like sulfuric acid, or hydrofluoric acid, or all the different acids that you've heard of, and things like. Actually, I think I've got a scale on here. At some point, maybe not actually. Like tomato juice is going to be acidic. Coca-Cola is going to be acidic. Let's see what else. Lemon juice is going to be acidic. Vinegar is actually acetic acid. But people don't know as much about bases. So bases, it just means, so bases have, they don't have as much H plus. They actually have more OH negative. Okay. So in this case, let me clear this out and do it this way. H plus is less than the OH negative concentration in a base. That just means that there's more hydroxide ions. What that translates into is things like oven cleaner or ammonia are good examples of bases. Antacids are bases. Baking soda is a base. So this is going to be anything that is, a number that's between 7 and 14. And these guys, bases can be just as harmful as strong acids can be. So, for example, sodium hydroxide is a very strong base, and I think it is used in treating hair. So, if you want to get like the platinum blonde, I think they use sodium hydroxide. It's nasty stuff. It's just as nasty as a concentrated acid would be. So that's kind of off subject, but I just wanted to talk about that because I know a lot of people don't understand that. So because the pH needs to be kept in check, it needs to be between 6 and it needs to be between 8. We have these things in our body called buffers. And most cells, not all, if you look at the stomach, that's definitely not the case, but in most cells, like for example your blood, in your blood cells, the pH is going to be around 7. And if it gets too low, if it starts to get to 6 or even 5, there's going to be something added that's called a buffer. And a buffer is a substance that helps to minimize changes in concentration between the H plus and the OH negative. A way to say that in more layman's terms is to say buffers keep the body from becoming too acidic, or on the other hand, keep the body from becoming too basic. Okay, so it keeps from too many H pluses being added, or it keeps from too many OH minuses being added. Okay, so that is an example of what a buffer does. I'm trying to think of a good test question. I actually have an illustrative example on the next slide, but before I get there, I want to talk a little bit more about this, because there was one. Let's say I have an aquarium, and I measure the pH of the aquarium with some pH paper, and I see that the pH is 5. Okay, we know that living organisms need to be between 6 and 8. So my question to you is, what would I add to the tank to raise the pH closer to 7? Okay. Now, I don't expect you to know the actual chemical that you would add, but you should be able to tell me that in this case, if I wanted to go from 5 to 7, I would need to add more OH negative. Okay, OH negative is base, and that will add more OHs, and it will raise the pH to 6, 7, depending on how much you add. Okay, so that would be the answer to that question. Okay, so that's an example of more of an application-based question where you would need to apply what you know about buffers, about what you know about acids and bases to answer a question. The next slide actually shows that as well in, again, one of our favorite illustrative examples. So this is an example of climate change and what happens to our oceans over time as we burn fossil fuels. So as we burn gasoline, as we burn, wood burning stoves do it as well. Coal burning plants for electricity. These are all generating a huge amount of carbon dioxide. Okay, so carbon dioxide is the main byproduct of fossil fuel combustion. So you burn wood, you burn gas, you burn coal, and carbon dioxide is going to be generated. That carbon dioxide is going to go into the air, and at some point, a portion of it is going to go back into the ocean. And it says 25% here. I'm not going to hold you accountable for how much goes back into the oceans. But the whole point is when carbon dioxide comes in contact with water, it will form carbonic acid. Okay, and that process is called ocean acidification. Again, name isn't really important. The idea of what's going on is, let me show you the diagram because I think this is more helpful. So here is our carbon dioxide. We've got a little jetliner that has given off through its jet fuel, it's producing carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to be absorbed into the water. It's going to be converted, and then eventually it's going to do something that is going to reduce. Let's see. I actually have to look at the next slide because I don't remember exactly what it produces. Let's look here together. Okay, so as the seawater acidifies, so as the carbon dioxide is dissolved into the water, that produces bicarbonate. Again, it's not really important so much about the details, but what that happens. So coral reefs need carbonate. You don't need to remember the actual formulas here. These guys, you just need to know the names. So carbonate is needed by coral reefs. In order to build a coral reef, you need carbonate. So you might have heard how the coral reefs are being destroyed, and that is a result of the acidification of the seawater. Carbon dioxide comes in, is dissolved into the seawater, and when that happens, the H pluses from the water combine with the carbon dioxide to produce this bicarbonate. So they produce the bicarbonate, and they're producing the bicarbonate by taking the carbonate away from the coral reefs. So the coral reefs don't have any, it's kind of like thinking, like a 2x4 to build a house. You need wood to build a house. So that wood, or in this case the carbonate, is taken away. It's put into a different form called bicarbonate. And that bicarbonate is not something the coral reefs can use. So coral reefs over time will die off because they can't produce more of themselves because the carbonate is not there. Right? So that's a good illustrative example of global climate change and as it relates to acidification. All right, I got a little more time here, so I'm going to move on after I stop making marks on the screen. And that last dog eruption was brought to you by Wilbur, who is scared to death of women walking down the street with baby strollers. Yeah. Cayenne, you too. Okay, sorry about that. Let's go on to chapter 4. There are 5 chapters in this unit, but 5 is pretty minimal, and 1, as we know, was just a few slides. So, in one section of reading. So, don't worry too much about 1 or 5. That won't be the bulk of it. It'll be 2, 3, and 4. All right. Last in this chapter, we want to talk about carbon and how it impacts living things. Okay. I know it seems like time hasn't gone by, but I actually paused it because I wanted to look forward to chapter 5, and I did misspeak. I'm sorry. Chapter 5 is actually 4 is the one that we're not going to spend that much time on. It's chapter 5 that is going to be more intense, and that's going to be on our macromolecules. But let's talk about 4 for right now. We've just got a couple minutes left, and I want to use that time to talk about carbon. So carbon is an interesting molecule because it is able to form 4 covalent bonds. Okay, so if you look at the outer shell of carbon, it has 1, 2, 3, 4. This is just the outer shell being shown. So it needs 4 more, which means that it can form bonds with 4 more atoms if needed. And that makes it a pretty good molecule or pretty good element for living things. Most of our body is carbon based, and that obviously doesn't include the water, which is not carbon based, but there's a whole branch of chemistry that is looking at things that have carbon in them. That is organic chemistry. So if you decide you want to go and do a pre-med track or nursing track or anything in biology, you're probably going to take an orgo class, and you're going to look at all the different carbon molecules. Now, organic molecules, like I said, have carbon in them, but biochemistry is actually the study of organic chemistry only as it applies to living organisms. So that's another class that if you go down that nursing medicine type branch or biology in general, you'll take biochem as well. And it's really the biochem that we're going to be focusing on in here because we don't really care about just organic. We're really more interested in just the living aspect. Okay, so some of this is a little bit of a review. The overall percentages, so there's chones, this is CHON, and there's also sulfur and phosphorus that make up a little lesser extent, but those are pretty fixed. So how much is carbon in us, in living things? It doesn't matter if it's a cat or if it's a dog or if it's a human or if it's a sea slug. They all have about the same amount of carbon, hydrogen, etc. In them. Carbon is the biggest one of these, and that again is because it can form 4 bonds, and you can make, it's just like the alphabet. I can make an inexhaustible number of words with 26 letters. Okay. And with carbon, you can just keep adding on carbons and you can make an inexhaustible number of organic molecules as well. As I said before, electron configuration is a huge part of that. Because it's got 4 valence electrons, it can form 4 covalent bonds. And what did we say about covalent bonds? They're the strongest, mid, or weakest of the bonds. The answer would be they are the strongest. So if you've got 4 covalent bonds, that's going to make carbon a very strong molecule. And if you have a strong molecule, it also means that you have a very stable molecule as well, because it's not going to break apart very easily. Carbon can form chains, and those chains can vary in length and they can vary in shape. So you can get all sorts of things. You can get what are called hydrocarbons, that just made up of carbon and hydrogen. Fats, for example, are hydrocarbons. They're just made up of hydrogen and carbon and actually oxygen as well. And obviously, our body has hydrocarbons. Here's fat. This is an actual picture of human fat tissue, or adipose tissue, as it's also called. And on the right is a picture of a fat molecule, which is just adipose shown in a kind of a stick figure drawing. A few chemical groups are key to molecular function. And let me see if we're going to talk about those. Yeah, it looks like we're going to actually talk about those key chemical groups a little bit later on. But I did want to talk a little bit about a couple of chemical groups that are important that are fat-based. And that is estradiol and testosterone, which are both steroids. They're hormones that are found in the body in varying amounts in human beings. So these sex hormones only differ in their chemical groups that are attached to the rings. And here's estradiol and testosterone. You will not have to remember the shape or the structure of estradiol and testosterone. I'm only showing you this because there are these side groups that are here, like this is what's called hydroxide, and this guy is called methane, or sorry, methyl, not methane. So these two are examples of those groups. These groups that you will need to remember are called functional groups. And it's a repeating pattern that is added onto a molecule to give it specific properties. Chart is shown on the next page. And there are, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these that I want you to know and understand. And after this lecture, and after you have studied these functional groups, I would like you to take a functional group quiz, which I will give you again after this lecture. And this is some of the tests that you are going to take are going to be, well, let's just put it this way. A lot of the tests that I give, it would be very hard to Google the answers. This functional group quiz that I'm going to give you is extremely easy, and you could cheat on it. And if you want to cheat on it, you can. However, if you do, it's going to bite you in the rear end later, because you do need to know some of these groups. And on later assessments, if you don't know, for example, what a carboxyl group is, sorry about that. If you don't know what a carboxyl group is, this guy here, then you won't be able to identify other compounds, and those won't be Googleable, for lack of a better word. So it's really to your advantage to make sure that you really understand these functional groups before you take that quiz. And if you don't do well in the quiz, make sure that you understand after you've taken it that what you missed and why you missed what you missed. Examples of, let me just go over functional groups one more time, because I feel like I kind of botched it the first time. So these are groups that could be put onto a protein, they could be put onto a carbohydrate, they could be put onto a hormone, but they give that particular compound different properties. You don't have to know this column, so you do not have to know anything here. And let me just go back and do this again. You don't need to know examples, so you don't need to know this. You don't need to know ethanol, or I don't even know what any half of these are. You don't need to know that. What you do need to know is OH, that carbon bound to double bound to an oxygen. This carbon bound to a double oxygen and an OH, which is also a hydroxyl. So what I'm circling here is what's in blue. Okay, and then being able to match that. This is a matching quiz to the name. So if I gave you OH, you could say that's hydroxyl. Or if I gave you SH, you would know that that was sulfhydryl. Okay, that's the extent of the quiz, and knowing those functional groups will be important because later I'm going to give you chemical compounds to identify, and if you don't know the functional groups, you won't be able to identify those. Okay. All right. I think I've now at this point gone over, so I'm gonna cut it short here. But I did want to get to those functional groups, and before you continue on, you should get through. Let's see, how far did we go? You should be through carbon and functional group of organic chemistry. And then also, I will post a quiz that I would like you to take before you proceed with the lectures. Again, it's, I think there's 8 questions, and they are the things in blue matched, and you have to match it with the name. Okay, carbonyl, hydroxyl, carboxyl, amino, phosphate, methyl, etc. Okay, so before you start back and go into section on ATP, please make sure that you have done that study guide and also completed that quiz. All right, I am about to get completely hoarse, so it's time for me to stop.